Today we have two talks for the webinar. So for those who are joining in for the first time, this is our webinar series to garner some discussion points for our scoping workshop that is coming up in 2025 March at LSU. So please look at the OCB website if you're interested, and you can register there. Uh, so for today, we're really thankful to have Dr. Robert Twilley and Dr. Marc Simard to give talks today. So we'll start with Dr. Robert Twilley. Robert Twilley is the Vice President of Research and Economic Development at LSU and a professor in my department, Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences. Robert is a lot of things, so it's hard to capture in one line, but maybe this would work. I would say he's a systems ecologist who is involved in developing ecosystem models that interface with engineering designs and for mostly coastal and wetland ecosystems. Does that capture, Robert?
Yep, that's pretty good. That's
Okay, thanks. And so with that,
this is recorded. I'll have to write that down and use it.
And with that, we'll start with Dr. Twilley's talk today. And Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's see. Make sure this all works. How's that? Is that good? So I want to thank Kanchan for the invitation, even though I think he had to send me the email 2 or 3 times before he got a decent response. But this has been actually, I've enjoyed putting this together. It's as they say, putting together a summary of what you've been doing in 20 minutes actually takes more time and effort than, say, a 1-hour presentation. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly. But I want to, share with you first. I grabbed slides from different presentations just to show the variety of groups and funding agencies. A lot of this started. I'll go back. A lot of this started with the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics. That was when we really established our sites out at Wax Lake and started to develop our concepts. And from that, we were funded. Frontiers of Earth Surface Dynamics funded us for several years. And then we had one of those coastal seas projects. We had a great team, and we were able to expand our work. And then you'll hear more about this. The Deltaic project allowed us to expand it. And now we have funding from the ERDIC, the Engineering Research and Development Center. And I've had great students, postdocs. It's been, a fabulous a decade or more now, because I guess 2005 was when the funding started with NSED. And so we, not an LTER, but we certainly have had the luxury or the fortune of having funding that has kept us going, working in this site. I want to lay down a global hypothesis right off the bat. And when you look at the longitudinal continuum of riparian systems along major rivers, there's a really nice catalog, if you will, and description of floodplains from the headwaters down to the coastal floodplain. And then at the very end, it just says estuary. And so one of the things that we've been very interested in is looking at these wetlands and seeing if there might be some more formal catalog and description of these ecosystems functionally, as well as their structure. And we call these coastal, and ones that we've focused on in prograding coastlines is what we refer to as coastal deltaic floodplains. And so we've been, looking at whether, that is distinct, and how do those floodplains and their biogeochemical patterns, differ or are similar to floodplains along this continuum. And so we've been, separating out questions related to transgressive versus prograding. I'll talk about that relative to the delta cycle a little bit. Tidal versus wave power, the degree of river connectivity. But again, our start was looking at prograding deltaic systems, the biogeochemistry of coastal deltaic floodplains, and we have a fabulous laboratory to do that here in coastal Louisiana, and that's at Wax Lake Delta, as you see here. That's part of the Atchafalaya Bay, an engineered channel, but with sort of a jet plume forcing that develops these delta lobes, and again has been the focus of our research to look at the chronosequence and delta development. Now, we learned early on that as we started, connecting the ecological succession with these biogeochemical patterns, that it's pretty complicated because the two factors, you don't have salinity as a gradient here, right? These are all freshwater. But you do have an elevation gradient and you have an age, or what I'm going to reference as ecosystem development gradient. And this, you have to be able to, when you ask questions and hypotheses about biogeochemical patterns, you've really got to factor in and nest those two key characteristics. And so one of the first things we spend our time on is characterizing the landscape into those two categories. What is the elevation, and at each of those elevations, what is the age? And Azure Bevington, one of my early graduate students working on this project during the INSEAD days, did just a fabulous job of putting that together. And the way we started, asking our hypothesis or testing our hypothesis is, again, hydrogeomorphic elevation, zones along a chronosequence, age, ecosystem development, time of emergence above water. That's what we're using as the definition of age. And so basically you see these T1, T2, T3, and T4. That's the chronosequence. But across each of the chronosequence regions or age regions, you have elevation. And so we would classify our experimental designs, as you see here, and we classified into three major elevation classes: subtidal, intertidal, supertidal. And then within each of those elevation classes, we would document the age, again, using historical photographs and matching evidence of when the land emerged above water. That's our definition. And there's some patterns that came out that were pretty interesting. Bulk density. Now, what's a little confusing here, T4 is the youngest. And so T4 is the youngest, T2 is the oldest. So we're left to right, you're going from younger to older in each of these classes. But you see bulk density decreasing both in subtidal and intertidal. You see the patterns not clear at all in supertidal. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then the other thing that's important is, what kind of gradients are we actually looking at relative to these biogeochemical patterns, nutrient dynamic patterns. And your experimental designs can go from 1.5 grams per cubic centimeter to 0.3 or even less. And so you had a pretty good, and if you look at organic matter, it's not surprising, right? Organic matter and bulk density have a correlation, and so as you age, as these ecosystems age, the organic matter content of the soil increases. And that happens both in the subtidal zones and in the intertidal zones. And this is going to be the major feature that I'm going to talk about as we walk through this. Again, the important thing is, well, what kind of gradients are we actually looking at in a delta that's about 60, I'm going to say 65 years old. And we're looking at, anywhere from 2 to 10%. In the supertidal, we find organic matter content up to 20%. So, you got a more order of magnitude in organic matter content. But the key is, as these soils age, not surprising, they start out as inorganic depositional environments. And as they're colonized by plants, and as elevation changes, those plants have a larger biomass, and the feedback loop of organic content in these soils increase. So how does that relate to nutrient patterns? What's the soil metabolism? And I'm going to focus on nitrogen in this talk. And this graph on the left, is the key factors of a delta in the latitude that we're working in. One is there is a strong soil respiration rate, and not surprising with percent organic matter. And then there's a temperature effect. And that 17 degrees is sort of the key, what we found to be the key differential and separating out these rates. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But there's a strong seasonal temperature slope with organic matter with oxygen consumption. The figure right under that is that shows you nitrogen fixation, same pattern. Increase with organic matter, but a different slope with different temperature regimes. Same with nitrate uptake. Bottom figure is nitrate uptake, same pattern with nitrate removal. So these dynamics, the metabolism has a strong relationship with age. But then the temperature can affect those biogeochemical patterns. Now, one thing we is asked early on. I had a student publish a paper in ecosystems on nitrate. How does this delta's mouth of the Mississippi River, very high nitrate from the Mississippi River, and what would be the biogeochemical patterns if you didn't have that high nitrate fertilization? So we would remove nitrate and look at some of these patterns. And one thing that was very interesting is there's relationship between nitrogen fixation and denitrification. And on your left, you see the slope and the magnitude of those values under no nitrate. But as the nitrates increase, and experiments here from 10 to 100 micromolar, you can see that relationship between fixation, the denitrification changes. And basically denitrification, it switches from being dominant by nitrogen fixation in low nitrate environments to being dominated by denitrification in high nitrate environments. So, you're looking at, you've got to remember, you're looking at, when we, in our studies, basically, you're looking at biogeochemical patterns that are artificial or modified by the nutrient enrichment that we have from agriculture upstream. We had a lot of fun with that, and we could talk more about it. Now, let me get to the bottom line here. Is a lot of our work has been getting to sort of leaky levees. A lot of our work, and I didn't mention this earlier, a lot of our work is, what's the role, what's the function of these coastal deltaic floodplains relative to their location, major rivers? They are the last place that nutrients are modified, if you will, or you have an exchange with wetlands before they get to the ocean, right? And so, and of course, all those other floodplains up major river systems, that's been a real focus of those studies, is how do they contribute to reducing nitrate, for example, and in major river watersheds before that nitrate gets to the ocean. And so we put together, we started working on budgets, and so you had to, what I want to do is I want to capture the factors that you have to consider as you do these budgets. And maybe there might be a few surprises here for you. One is you start with a rate of nitrate removal per unit time, per unit area, right? Micromoles per meter square per hour. That's all our flux measurements. And we have flux measurements, as I showed you, nitrate removal across percent organic matter, relative to age and also elevation. And but the question is, how you don't remove nitrate unless there's contact. So you got to look at the time of inundation, and then you have to look at the temperature effects, which I showed you, which is important. And you have to know, well, what's the area of the total subtidal area versus intertidal versus supertidal? Because and when you look at it, what's interesting is the supertidal zone, if you look on the right, has the smallest area, but it has one of the highest inundation. Lowest time of inundation. So it has a low area and it has a low time of inundation, but it has the highest organic matter. So it has the highest rate per meter square per hour, but it has the lowest number of hours and it has the lowest area. Intertidal zone, 90% inundation, but 10% organic matter. So you saw the relationship. It's younger, removes less per unit time per unit area. Subtidal has only about 5% organic matter, therefore the lowest rates per time per unit area, but it dominates an area. So when you factor all that in plus the temperature, what you end up with is that the annual nitrate, bottom right, removal of milligrams of nitrogen per year, subtidal dominates. And compared to intertidal and supertidal. So most of the nitrate removal, even at the highest rates, we find are in the supertidal, high percent organic matter, but the ecosystem as a whole, the largest amount of nitrate removal is by the subtidal regions of these deltas. Now, the question then, of course, this is a question nature gave us, right? And so you take a PhD student, Song Lee, who all of a sudden gets hammered, her experiments get hammered by a hurricane, and you turn that into an opportunity. And so we asked the question, how does nutrient biogeochemistry of these coastal deltaic floodplains change in response to disturbance in ecosystem development? And Hurricane Barry came along, and on the right, what you see is these beautiful Nelumbo vegetation with the salt that came in with the, you can see the increase in whatnot. Yeah, you see the increase in salinity in red, and went up to 4 parts per thousand during the hurricane event and wiped out the vegetation. So the question is, okay, well then that nitrate removal, how does that change? Does it become leaky, when you get hit by one of these disturbances? And what we found is that one of the major changes, although I thought I'd put a text in here for you, but look on the right, and I'll explain the experimental design real quick. What we did was we looked at 3 organic matter zones: the lower soil organic matter zone, the intermediate soil organic matter zone, and higher soil organic matter zone. We had pre-hurricane measures at each, and then we measured the response 1 month after the hurricane and 2 years after the hurricane. So what you're looking at in the bars in lower soil organic matter, the darker is pre-treatment, and then the 2 lighter colors are post-hurricane. And the bulk density didn't change much in the lower and the intermediate. But in the higher soil organic matter, where the bulk density is lower, not surprising, the deposition from the hurricane increased the bulk density. And if bulk density went up during that disturbance, not surprising, organic matter goes down. Now we've got one of the major controls of biogeochemical based on ecosystem development age now being modified by a storm. And it basically resets the ecosystem development. And not surprising, when you look at nitrate removal, it goes down because the organic matter has gone down. And as I showed, some of the relationships before. But the interesting aspect of this is, and this is a little complicated graph, but when you look at all those blue solid and open measures, and again, I'm plotting soil organic matter versus total denitrification rate. And you look at those blue, there wasn't much change at all, right? As I showed you in the bulk density or the organic matter. So pre and post rates are pretty similar. Even in the intermediate soil organic, the red, very little change because of the disturbance. And so you see very little change in the denitrification rates. The green is the high organic matter. It dropped in organic matter content, increased in bulk density, and we saw the denitrification rate slide back down, but right along our general model of lower denitrification rates in response to this disturbance. How long does it take to get back? I'm not sure, but you may say, well, then, does that increase the leakiness of a delta? Well, go back. Remember, these are higher soil organic matter or higher elevation. Therefore, they have the least time of inundation, and they have the smallest area, total area. So I haven't done the calculation. I should, sorry, but I could take these and get and just say, okay, we're going to wipe out or do the reduction in percent with percent organic matter and give you the actual change in the nitrate removal of the delta, and that would give you some idea of how these systems change. Now, I've used up I'm up at 24 minutes, and I don't want to get into Marc's talk. I will just say that with the Deltaic program, one area we've been we started it with the coastal seas, but what we've done is we've been expanding our hypotheses from expanding it from prograding deltas to degrading deltas, to deltas that are deteriorating. And right next to the Chaffly Basin is Terrebonne Basin. And what you see here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you see these lines. The white line is the shoreline estimated in 1932. And the blue line is the shoreline estimated in 2010. And you can see that where sediment enrichment, sediment connection occurs, the shoreline has been stable during that time. But in Terrebonne, right next in the basin right next to it, because the sediment has been cut off down by Lafourche, then the delta has been deteriorating, and so we have basically an active versus an inactive delta to study these nutrient dynamics. And there's been some really interesting patterns that we're seeing. And I got to go and show this. I'm not going to go through all these slides. But what we are setting up right now is we've just finished completing one of our gas flux systems that we're putting along these gradients, and to see how these systems vary across the salinity zone in both an active versus inactive delta. I'll stop there, and because I want to make sure Marc gets plenty of time to talk about Deltaic.
Yes. Thank you, Robert. So we have time for maybe a couple of questions if somebody has any question, or we can hold off for the end. Anyone who has a quick question would like to go for it? Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, I think we can hold off for the end, and we can move on to the next talk by Marc Simard. I think Robert gave a really nice intro for that talk, so it would be a nice transition for that. So we're going to switch to Marc now. Marc,
yes.
Want to share?
Yep.
So thanks, Marc, for giving this talk today. Dr. Simard is a senior scientist at NASA JPL, and he's the principal investigator for the Deltaic project that Robert just mentioned in the Mississippi Delta. And he's also the science PI for the SWOT, especially focusing on the coastal areas. And he's going to talk about how the hydrodynamic models are calibrated, which goes along with the nutrient dynamics that Robert said. So really good connectivity between these two, Robert. And Marc, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert, for the primer on what I'm going to show here. So here we're going, as Robert mentioned earlier, to describe a little bit the Deltaic mission, but I'm also going to be going a little bit further because we don't want to only study the Mississippi River Delta, but we'd like to go global at some point. So I'll show how we intend to do that. So the title here is the CalVal, so calibration validation of hydrodynamic models. And again, starting with NASA's Deltaic airborne mission. It's an airborne mission in coastal Louisiana in the two basins that Robert was showing earlier, in the Atchafalaya Basin here, which is prograding, and the Terrebonne Basin, which is losing land, as Robert was showing earlier. I'd like to thank some collaborators that produced some of the slides that I'm showing here. So Kathleen Jones, which is the co-PI of the Deltaic mission, Alex Christensen, which is online, I saw her name, Daniel Jensen, Antoine Soloy, and Pascal Matt. So the Deltaic mission, this is the logo. I think Robert had it on his slide earlier. If you're interested in more information, you can find it on the web here, Deltaic JPL NASAGov. This was a fairly large project involving 12 co-investigators from 8 different institutions, which coincidentally were all from coastal states, starting with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We're in California, Louisiana, with Robert Twilley and his team, from Texas, Paula Pasalacqua, Florida, Edward Castaneda, North Carolina, Tamlin Pavelski, and Massachusetts, we had Cedric Fichot and Sergio Fagarazzi from Boston University, and Liviu Jozan from Woods Hole. So this is an animation of showing the wetland loss and gain since 1988 using a Landsat time series. So here we're focusing on the two basins I was telling you about. So the prograding Atchafalaya Basin and the receding Terrebonne Bay area. Here along all of the coast, we estimated using this Landsat time series that we have a loss of about 54 kilometers squared per year. Of course, it's not every year the same, but overall, that's the rate that we're looking at since of loss that we're looking at since 1988. So there are two processes by which we can gain land and keep up with sea level rise. So the first one is, of course, mineral sediment deposition. And the second process is through production from plants, so root production and litter deposition. So we have the inorganic and the organic part. So Deltaic, the question here, the overarching question is, will river deltas completely drown, or some parts of these deltas accumulate sufficient sediment and produce enough plants to keep pace with relative sea level rise? And that question arose because some studies showed that deltas don't have enough sediment, so they are sediment starved and will not keep up with sea level rise. And sometimes those models are like bathtub models, but some parts may keep up, some others may not. So we're trying to bring the scale of these processes to figure out which parts can survive sea level rise. So we will evaluate with Deltaic, or we are evaluating the roles of vegetation in soil accretion rates and the channel network density. So the implementation goes as follows. So we had two campaigns, one in the spring of 2021 during the high discharge of the Mississippi River, and one in the fall, which is the low part, but high biomass. So we had these two different extremes in environmental environmental conditions. So we had 3 aircrafts flying near simultaneously to make different measurements. I will tell you a little bit more about it, of the hydrology and the ecology of the system. And we had boats and boots on the ground at the same time and within the same period. We flew these 3 aircrafts here, which each an instrument on board. So the UAVSAR system, so that's a radar operating in L band. The second one is air SWOT at Ka band, and AVRIS-NG, which is an imaging spectrometer. So these two radars here look at the hydrological processes. So with UAVSAR, by repeating the same imaging several times during one flight. So one flight for each of these aircraft is about 5 hours. So if you keep repeating the same measurement, you can look at the tidal wave going in and out of the wetlands. This is with UAVSAR. With the air SWOT system, the other radar, we don't see through plants. So we cannot see water surface elevation when there's vegetation. It's not very accurate. So, but we can look at open water surfaces and the changes in water level in these open water surfaces. So these two radar measurements are complementary. One looks at water level change in the wetlands where there's vegetation. The other one looks in open water in channels, lagoons, lakes, right? And we have AVRIS-NG. So this one was used for two purposes. First was to look at the water quality, in particular to estimate the amount of sediment in the water. The second purpose of AVRIS-NG was to look at plant structure across the region. These are three types of measurements that were obtained. So the first one here, this is a transect of water surface elevation along the Wax Lake outlet. For those that know, the Wax Lake outlet is right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor actually.
You can say
Can you see?
Yes.
You can? Okay.
Yes.
So, so this is a transect of the elevation along this channel here, this very straight channel, which is called the Wax Lake outlet. So you can see that we're going from 1.8 meters to about 80 centimeter at the mouth of the this channel. And the slopes that is measured here through air SWOT measurements, so this is a spatially continuous measurement of slope, is about, it varies between 1 to 3 centimeters per kilometer. This is extremely shallow. It's very flat. So you can imagine if you look a kilometer away, you have only 1 centimeter of elevation difference. And we are detecting that with an airplane. So this is very accurate measurement and very interesting also to see this continuous measurement. So if you add gauges, for example, we have these 4 gauges. Well, these are just point measurements along that transect. You don't see what's happening in between those measurements. Okay, so on the top right, you have UAVSAR measurements. So here is the image that you're seeing here is the amount of water level change within 5 hours. So each of the pixels in your image here is like a gauge measurement, a water level gauge measurement. So if you take a pixel here, for example, you can see that the water is receding. This is from UAVSAR, and you see this is in hours. So in the airplane comes back every about 30 minutes. So you can see the water receding from the system. At the bottom here, at the bottom right, this is from AVRIS-NG. So this is an imaging spectrometer with 425 bands. So that's a lot of information on the color of the plants and also the water. So we use that to estimate the total suspended solids in the system, which is what you're showing here, what you're shown here in colors. So going from 0 to 100 milligrams per liter, showing that the Wax Lake Basin, the Atchafalaya Basin, sorry, has a lot more sediment than the Terrebonne, which makes sense because Terrebonne is, as Robert mentioned, is sediment starved. So it's been cut from sediment input. Okay, so this is all the boxes that you see here are the areas that were covered by the aircrafts and the imaging. So I'm not going to talk about that, but that's just to show you this spatial mix of data sets that we have, and all those pins that you see are the field measurements. In yellow are gauges that we installed in addition to the existing CRMS network. And the other pins are different measurements of water quality or plant structure. All of that is freely available. If you Google Deltaic, you can get all of that data from raw to processed. So this is what it looks like when you look at the aircrafts flying. So near simultaneously, you had air SWOT, UAV SAR, and ABRIS-NG. You will notice that air SWOT and UAV SAR keep repeating the same pattern for 5 hours because they're looking at the tide coming in and out of the system. ABRIS-NG was mainly used for coverage. So we just want an instantaneous estimate of water quality and plant structure. So we don't need to repeat too much. However, we did repeat in the spring and the fall for ABRIS-NG. For UAV SAR and air SWOT, we did several repeats to capture the tide going up and the tide going down in both the spring and the fall. So we have these measurements from, for example, here, UAV SAR on the left. So this is the elevation, the water surface elevation change within the wetland. And we can compare these measurements from UAV SAR with our hydrodynamic models. So this is how we calibrate our models with the remote sensing as well as the in-situ data. So we compare and we adjust both the friction as well as the bathymetry. So at the end, once our model is calibrated, we obtained these mineral soil accretion maps. So that does not contain yet the contribution from plants. So this is only from mineral accretion. And again, you can also find these on the web. And we use this mineral accretion map in the NUMAR model, which was produced by Robert Twilley's team. And some of the mechanisms inside he discussed earlier. But I wanted also to add here that this model is producing accretion rates over maybe 100 years, almost 100 years in our case, so until 2100. That includes both mineral sediment inputs and organic contribution. So this is the accretion from both processes that Deltaic was trying to figure out. So if you look at the rates across the landscape, and you can imagine the scenarios of relative sea level rise, you can figure out which parts of the system will be lost and which ones may survive. Okay, so this is only one river delta, so the Mississippi River Delta. How do we expand to other deltas around the world? Well, clearly we could fly aircrafts all around the world, but that would be quite costly, and the logistics to achieve that. In the case of Deltaic, with Robert's team, so we had quite a lot of experience there, and it was the easy case, and it was not that easy. So imagine going to all these places with aircrafts. It's just not even thinkable. So aircrafts can fly every 30 minutes. You can capture the time scales of tides going in and out of systems. With satellites, it's very different. So each of these aircrafts that we flew had a corresponding sensor in space or will soon be in space. So for example, the UAV SAR, which is an L-band sensor, is similar to the NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar mission. So it's a radar mission again that will be launched next year. It will have a repeat of 12 days. So very different from this 30 minutes. So it's going to be hard to capture tides, right? Air SWOT is similar to the SWOT mission, surface water and ocean topography, which is currently in space. It's been there for a couple of years already, almost a couple of years already. And then we have the AVRIS-NG, which is similar to what another mission that's coming online soon, SBG, Surface Biology and Geology. But you can also use other optical sensors such as Landsat, the Landsat time series or Sentinel-2. But again, the repeat is not the same. It's going to be very difficult. So SWOT is a K-band sensor. It's measuring water surface elevation across the globe in oceans, lakes, rivers, and so on, every open water surfaces around the globe, as long as they're large enough. So you can capture channels that are maybe 50 to 100 meters wide. Whatever is thinner, don't expect much. But here we have instantaneous measurements of water surface elevation and a slope along the channels from which we can get discharge globally. The repeat here is 21 days. So if you account for ascending and descending orbit, you have at least 2 observations along the equator. You have 2 observations at least every 21 days. So again, that's pretty far from the 30 minutes of aircrafts. So it was launched in December 16th, 2022. There was a CalVal period from in April to July, which was a one-day repeat on very few deltas and estuaries. The Mississippi River Delta was not one of those. So we had other experiments going on in the St. Lawrence in Quebec, the Como estuary in Gabon, and the Guayas estuary in Ecuador. With this sensor, I just want to add something here. We are able to estimate slopes in rivers to an accuracy of 1.7 centimeter per kilometer. So that's extremely accurate. You have to think we're making these measurements from an altitude of 891 kilometers in space. So this is unbelievable, and it actually works better than that. NISAR will be launched next year. So again, that's a radar. So it will make measurements of water surface elevation in wetlands globally every 12 days. But that's not one of its main missions. It's more for monitoring of forests, volcanoes, earthquakes, ice around the globe. So this is just a bonus measurements that we get, but will be very useful to expand our Deltaic framework capabilities. Okay, talking of which, so this is a measurements of SWOT. This is water surface elevation from 31 meters to 28. So this is with respect to WGS 84. That's why you have these strange numbers. So when we talk about water surface elevation with SWOT, we're not talking about depth, right? This is the water surface elevation as a function of the center of the Earth. We don't know anything about depth. Unless you have some other measurements of depth, we are fairly clueless. Although these measurements can be used to improve bathymetry, you can see some papers about that. So this is one measurement, so one pass at one particular time. So you can see along this river, there's a slope from which we can estimate discharge. So here is an image of the type of measurements you get. So this is the water level gauge cycle, which is very fast in red. And on top of it, you have the measurements from SWOT, which are several measurements. In this case, this is in the St. Lawrence River. So we have several measurements every 21 days. So you can see the resonance of the measurements, which is several times per 21 days with the hourly gauge measurement. So you can capture some of that tidal range, but you don't capture the tidal cycle. So what we do is we take these points, we take very long time series over a year or two, and we do harmonic analysis of the tidal components. And from that harmonic analysis with these very few points, we're able to extract the tidal components from these systems. So this is, again, an example of those tidal components that we're able to retrieve over the St. Lawrence River. So this is very different from an estuary, but we're doing it from a river delta, but we're doing the same thing for river deltas. But on estuaries, what's interesting is because of the width of these estuaries, which is several kilometers, we can even see longitudinal gradients in elevation and tidal component. So, they're not linear slopes. There's also slopes in across the rivers, which is very interesting. All right, so I'm going to stop here. And if you're interested in more data, I will send you to this website here, and you should also Google data on the ORNL DAC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. I think we have quite a bit of time to get into the discussion. Maybe I can start off with a question I had for Robert, and it's a two-part question. Part of it goes to Mark too. So Robert, you showed that Hurricane Barry impact and how the system can become leaky. So for sure, it's becoming leaky for nitrate. It also feel like when all this vegetation is decaying, it's also becoming leaky for carbon.
Yeah.
Because of all the decomposition. So I was wondering, after Barry, we had a little bit of a quiet time. Did you see the recovery back? And can we kind of combine with the hydrodynamic model that Mark showed to understand how much leakiness happened between such episodic events?
Yeah, so we, with the NUMAR model, the numerical model that, is based on soil formation and the processes, and you really can break it down into, as Mark just, a nice little animation, Mark, I hadn't seen that, where the sediment deposition, you have the surface processes that contribute to soil formation, and then you have the subsurface processes. And what you see with age in the wetland is, as that percent organic matter increases, basically that's from the over time, the net effect of the biomass on the soil. So that's accumulation. That's carbon accumulation in the delta from the ecological, features that are developing, the wetland plants on the surface. And so when you get a disturbance like a hurricane, you wipe that production out, and so it's next growing season before you start seeing that production start to stabilize again, that carbon. And while that's happening, of course, you got respiration. So but what I don't know, I mean, the theory will tell you that early successional stages, you get a larger net accumulation of carbon than later successional stages. And so, we haven't tracked it long enough to really know whether or not a disturbance like a hurricane in the long term actually gives you higher carbon accumulation. So you got to put a timestamp on this concept of leaky and non-leaky. Yeah, it might leak for, say, even 5 to 7, 8 years after a disturbance. But once that organic productivity sometimes is stimulated from a disturbance, and you might see higher carbon accumulation. Now a lot of what I'm describing there is a lot of that's based on what we see in mangroves, to be honest. I mean, that's a very common response in mangroves. The mangroves in South Florida, believe it or not, when they get hit by a hurricane, their below ground production actually increases. And so you get this young successional carbon rate of productivity and which might smooth out what you see as leaky carbon initially after the disturbance. Anyway.
Thanks. Thanks.
I had a similar question, but it was very specific to alkalinity. Whether similar question to Kenshin's about the leakiness of the delta after it's perturbed or after it's disturbed. And I was just wondering if you had also measured alkalinity, especially when you're doing these nitrate measurements, to see whether you notice anything different in alkalinity fluxes.
Yeah, we haven't looked at that. I mean, the carbon cycle that we've been focused on is mainly, what the net accumulation in the soil and what the plant biomass production is. And I don't know what the pore water alkalinity would look like, after a disturbance. You do get that salinity shock. You saw it go up to 4 parts per thousand, but that recedes. I don't know if you noticed in the figure, but that salinity decreases, pretty quickly. That's because of the surface water runoff. And what we do know is that those hurricane events with that salt shock in the surface water does not penetrate. The residence time of that water is so short, it does not penetrate into pore water. So there is no legacy of that hurricane salt in the ecosystem. As soon as it goes in, hits the surface water, and it really that's what disturbs the plants. But that as soon as that storm passes, the surge moves out, and very little of that salt, like I say, remains in the pore water. So, don't know. We didn't get into that kind of detail, but that's the dynamic of a storm event.
Thanks very much.
Yes, I have a question for maybe both of you. So both of you talked a lot about the sub-aerial part of the deltas, but do you have sort of ideas for how we can use some of this satellite technology to see where sediment and nutrients are going in the subaqueous portions of the deltas?
Ooh. Go for it, Mark.
Yep. I was muted. So with radar, we definitely cannot do that. It's just about surface structure. We don't see that type of material in the water. If any of these say nutrients or it has to contribute to color somehow of the water. If it contributes to color, you can see it. Otherwise, and it's probably not the only component that contributes to color, so it's all convolved together. So the only way to be able to say find out the trajectory of a particle or chemical in the water is through models. So you must use remote sensing with models to do that. Of course, with in situ data, but the in situ data typically is used to generate the models. So, but as long as you have your model, I think it's possible, but you cannot observe it.
Yeah, and the other thing we did was, we did a lot of coring to sort of look at the total carbon of Wax Lake Delta. And, there's a lot of, believe it or not, I mean, even though the percentage of the carbon might be lower, there's, if you look at the total aerial and subaerial, carbon budget, there's a lot of carbon that is accumulated before it emerges. I mean, you know, I had a student doing a dissertation, and I don't know if she actually separated those two out, but we did. I mean, it was striking how much carbon is in that subaerial. Or
See Christoph, and then yep. So Christoph, you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks for taking my question. I was wondering, Mark, if you said you could with the SWOT satellite, you could estimate the water flux. If there are any ways to estimate also the particle flux that goes with it, and globally, and at least in the main rivers, and how would you do that?
Okay, so one of the SWOT products is river discharge globally. Of course, that does not work in tidally influenced rivers. It's going to be a lot harder, but you do have the input of the rivers into the models. So you have to go through models. So if you want to get the export of carbon or sediment toward the sea, you need the models. There's no way around it. You can just use remote sensing to calibrate those models.
Yeah, you want to go next?
Of course, yes. Thanks so much to both of you. I had a question for Mark. Really impressive, by the way, to see the accuracy of the instruments at such a distance. And looking at expanding to like other deltas and estuaries around the world, yeah, I can see how you get the hydrodynamics, but how would you get into the morphodynamics or sediment budgets, perhaps?
Yeah. So something there's so much material in 20 minutes, it's kind of hard to capture everything. But if the Deltaic delivered not only the data, but the models. So you will see that on our site, not this one, but this one gives you a link to ORNL. It's Oak Ridge Research National Laboratory. It's a distributed archive. So we have the remote sensing data, the field data, and we also have the models. So we have several model implementations. The animation that I showed in the very first slide was based on Anuga, which is a Python implementation solving for the shallow water equations. And it does not have sediment transport in it. So the University of Texas and Paula Pasalacqua's team have developed something that goes on top of that model, which is called Dorado. So Dorado is also available on the web. So they're sharing it. And so this is for Anuga. We also have implementations in Delft 3D. So Delft 3D has the necessary modules to do sediment transport. You can look at salinity gradients and so on. So all we did is calibrate the hydrodynamics and the sediment using, because we have a picture from Abris NG, right, of the sediment distribution. So we can calibrate the model, the model with that as well.
Very cool. Thank you.
All those models
I'll
are.
check it out. Yeah.
Please download and use and publish.
Yeah.
Liz, yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. My question for Robert, I really liked your talk, and nice to use Lafourche as an example of like an abandoned delta lobe to study how the dynamics are over longer time scales and in places where it's not connected to the active river. And then in the Mississippi Delta, you also have the Wax Lake Delta for the modern active delta lobe. So really nice variety. And I read in the Louisiana local news that Bayou Lafourche is going to be reconnected to the Mississippi River at Donaldsonville through a pumping station to improve the water quality.
Right.
I guess this doesn't deliver sediment to Lafourche, but only water suspended.
Yeah, it's mainly it's not a diversion. It's or a sediment diversion. you know, a lot of those communities still draw their drinking water from the bayou, basically. Just as New Orleans, you know, a lot of the communities in the lower Mississippi River draw their drinking water from the river. So in both cases, you know, we've had instances of saltwater intrusion. And so basically they're pumping water down Bayou Lafourche to protect those drinking water facilities. But it won't have any effect on the sediment budget. Yeah. What was on the books, but has not really, got to the design phase, but never, I don't think, made it to the construction, is to use the Intracoastal Waterway to move water from the Atchafalaya east into Terrebonne. But they had some restricted areas and some navigation issues that they had to get around, and that became a problem. But that was on the books for quite a while. Try to move water east from the Atchafalaya into Terrebonne.
Yeah. Cool. Well, the reason I ask is like when you think about an abandoned delta lobe, then it's abandoned like in terms of new sediment, new like clastic growth, but also in terms of fresh water delivery, right? If it's in an ocean. So when you design the next steps of your study, are you going to sample areas that would get the fresh water input from the pumping and then areas that don't get fresh water? And
well, what we'd love, you know, it's already started. I mean, a lot of people are working on this already. But you know, the obvious next experimental basin is the Barataria, because that's where the sediment diversion is planned. It's gone through design. They actually broke ground for construction, and then we changed leadership at the state level. And just recently we had, in fact, I just saw published in the newspaper yesterday that a letter from the federal government saying that you're jeopardizing some of the funds that we have for this big project if you don't move forward with it. And so I don't know what the impact will be, but that will be a basin that was disconnected from the river, the Barataria, and then reconnected with a sediment diversion. So that will be quite a fascinating experiment, and it's anticipated to have you know, enough sediment to build wetlands in the basin. I see Carol's got her hand up.
thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much, both Robert and Mark. That was really great. I guess I have a question for Mark, and maybe this might be better answered by Luca and Sergio. It was one of the slides that you showed on the mineral soil accretion map for mostly Terrebonne area. And when I was looking at that, I actually had to take a screenshot on my phone so I could be like, oh, wow, that's really cool, and look at it a little bit longer. But it was neat because, you know, we know that there's edge effects, you know, where we expect there to be higher accretion rates, where, you know, you're right close to a shoreline or a creek bank. But there kind of looked like on that map, there was a hot spot of higher accretion further inland. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas or thoughts of that. Is that because those are areas that are deteriorating more rapidly, and it's more marsh cannibalization that's happening, like shoreline erosion, and that material is then making it onto those marshes, as opposed to those more coastal seaward salt marshes were showing a lower mineral soil accretion? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. So as you suggested, yes, I would rather have Sergio or Luca discuss that. But just a note here is that this model has a spatial resolution of 90 meters. So it might have some issues looking at levees and what's happening very close to the shoreline. But maybe, Robert, you have an idea about to explain this distribution.
Now, I will say what Carol, what you do notice, and I haven't. This is a map I really haven't spent much time on, But you know, when you look at terrebone, you do see the phenomena that you're talking about. You see more on the eastern side of the basin, whereas on the western side you see more of the deposition right along the edge, the marsh edge that's right along. And so I think it might be a dominant wind effect or something. I don't know.
Okay, okay. Cool. Well,
because
I'll
our
definitely follow
research-
up with Luca and Sergio, talk with them about that. It's just
Yeah.
an interesting phenomenon.
Now, our research sites were on the western side, and we had feldspar measurements, and we do see really high sediment, and it corroborates what you're seeing in that image. Those high sediment inorganic mass accumulation rates in this image match what we saw in the field. We didn't have any feldspar measurements over on the eastern side of the area, but it is consistent. And it's quite fascinating because the freshwater sites, you don't see any sediment, inorganic accumulation. The highest accumulation rates in terrebone are in the more saline sites, and in the Chaflaya, the higher inorganic accumulation is on the freshwater sites.
Right, right. The riverine material.
Exactly. It just flips. I mean, when you go from that prograding to degrading, the inorganic deposition goes from fresh to salt.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Robert. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you. I think we are past the hour. Thank you so much, Mark and Robert, for the fantastic talk and also the good discussion from the audience. I hope to see some of you at the Delta workshop next year.